The branch of philosophy known as metaphysics is one of the most controversial, and this controversy extends right down to the question of what metaphysics even is. The word metaphysics literally means beyond the physical, and so the study of metaphysics would appear to be the study of those things that transcend physical matter, such as ideas or concepts, the human soul, angels, and other divine realities. The first one to speak of metaphysics as a proper object of study was, in fact, Aristotle, who composed a very long work simply called the Metaphysics. Interestingly, Aristotle does not seem to confine the study of metaphysics, as the name would suggest, to purely non-material things. As he defines it, metaphysics is the science of being, or better still, the science of being qua being. But what does that mean? We might begin to understand this confusing expression by first seeing that Aristotle has a very straightforward concept of what constitutes a science. As he conceives it, a science is really just a body of knowledge that corresponds to some coherent or identifiable segment of reality. So the science of botany is the study of that segment of reality known as plants. The science of ornithology is the study of that segment of reality we call birds. And the science of politics is the study of that segment of reality known as political communities. Reality, then, can be studied with a view to any of its parts or segments. And this is what constitutes a science in the strict Aristotelian sense. All sciences, therefore, are sciences of being or existence, but the vast majority are sciences of being qua some division or part of being, such as plants, birds, or political communities. What makes metaphysics so unique, then, is that it is the science of being qua being. In other words, it is the study of beings simply as beings. And from this it follows that only in the science of metaphysics does the philosopher finally penetrate to the fundamental principles of reality or existence itself. What does it mean for something to exist? What does it mean for something to be a being at all? These are the kinds of questions that metaphysics sets out to answer. If metaphysics is the study of the most fundamental principles of reality, it will certainly include, but not be confined to, immaterial or non-physical things. And in fact, many of the principles of physical reality, such as the distinction between matter and form and the four causes, will come under the science of metaphysics as well as physics, or natural philosophy. One distinction to which Aristotle pays careful attention in his Metaphysics is that between actuality and potentiality. As we might recall from Lecture 4, these concepts allow Aristotle to account for the phenomenon of change. A thing changes by going from a state of potentiality to actuality, as when a child, having learned the piano, goes from the state of being potentially musical to being actually musical. As Aristotle and Aquinas both understand, being or existence is a mixture of potentiality and actuality, which accounts for the fact that, contrary to what Parmenides thought, the existing world is a world of different kinds of beings, as well as a world of change. This analysis of being comes through more clearly if we look at Aristotle's famous doctrine of the 10 categories of being, which we might also understand as the 10 ways in which an existing thing can be said to have actuality or potentiality. In other words, there are 10 ways in which something can rightly be said to be or to exist. The first and most important of these categories we have already seen in Lecture 4, the category that Aristotle calls substance. Every existing thing in the world is some kind of substance or another. a dog, a cat, a tree, a human being. These all are substances possessing dogness, catness, treeness, or humanity. When I say that Socrates is a human being, therefore, I am specifying the kind of substance that Socrates is. Substance is the most important of the 10 categories, because it's the only category of being that is necessary to the thing possessing it. Socrates cannot lose his humanity without ceasing to be Socrates. To be sure, when Socrates dies, the body that belonged to him remains, but becomes another substance altogether, a corpse, which has undergone a substantial change. But not every way of being or existing refers directly to a thing's substance. In fact, the remaining 9 categories of being are what Aristotle calls accidental, meaning that these ways of being can be acquired or lost, while the substance that acquires or loses them remains. Let us continue to use Socrates as our example. In addition to being a human, Socrates is also white, which refers to a certain quality he possesses. He may also be around 200 pounds in weight, which refers to what Aristotle would call quantity. Socrates also exists in the 4th century BC, which refers to time. He exists in Athens, which refers to place. At a given moment, Socrates may be thinking or philosophizing, which refers to a certain action he is performing. He may also be being looked at, admired, condemned, or sentenced to death, which refers to certain things he undergoes. Additionally, Socrates may be sitting or standing, which refers to a certain kind of posture that he takes on. Furthermore, it might be true to say of Socrates that he is an Athenian, or a member of the army, which is the category that Aristotle calls state. And finally, there are certain things about Socrates that are true of him only in relation to others. He is most likely taller than his wife, or wiser than his students. As Aristotle explains, his height and wisdom considered alone may refer to quality or quantity, but when seen in comparison with others, we must admit a new category that he calls relation. So to review, there are 10 distinct ways in which Socrates, or anything for that matter, can be said to exist. The most crucial of these is the kind of substance that they are. But the existence of nearly all substances can be spoken of in terms of the remaining 9 accidental categories as well: quality, quantity, time, place, action, undergoing, posture, state, and relation. Again, why do we call the remaining 9 categories accidental? For the simple reason that a substance can acquire or lose properties or characteristics under those categories and still remain essentially what they are. In other words, Socrates could change color, lose 50 pounds, live into the 3rd century BC, cease philosophizing, cease being admired, stand up or sit down, lose his citizenship, and somehow become shorter than his wife, and while remaining essentially or substantially what he was before, namely a human being. Outside of these 10 categories, there just are no other ways in which Socrates or anything else could be said to exist, which is precisely why Aristotle considers these the 10 categories of being. To understand this teaching better, we should look a little more closely at the category that Aristotle says is the most important, namely substance. It may seem obvious to point out, but substances are the only things that actually possess any kind of independent existence. That is to say, the 9 accidental categories require substances to exist in. There is no such thing as 5 feet tall all by itself. There are only substances that are 5 feet tall. There is no such thing as taller than one's brother all by itself, but rather something or someone that is taller than his brother, and so on. Still, the 9 accidental categories are real aspects of things, even if they don't have independent existence unto themselves. The things that exist most fully or most completely, however, are substances. And to identify the kind of substance that something is to identify the most important thing about it, what Aquinas will later call its essence. The notion of a substance developed by Aristotle may remind us in many ways of Plato's theory of the forms. As we may recall from Lecture 3, Plato taught that the forms were independently existing essences, belonging to an immaterial realm. In other words, Socrates, Plato, Alexander the Great, your 4th grade teacher, and Eleanor Roosevelt can all be said to be human beings only if there is such a thing as humanity that may be predicated of them. These 3 triangles can only be said to be triangles if there really is such a thing as triangularity that may be predicated of them. Thus, Plato taught that these independently existing forms or essences were necessary preconditions for anything true being said about anything. What sense does it make to say, he reasoned, that Fido is a dog, unless there actually is such a thing as dogness? Aristotle, however, argues that Plato goes too far. One can say that Fido is a dog, says Aristotle, without having to assume the existence of dogness as a separate entity from Fido and the other things that have this same substantial form. In other words, Aristotle agrees with Plato that there are forms, but these forms exist only in the things that possess them. The form of humanity exists in human beings. The form of tree exists in living trees. The form of dogness exists in actual living dogs. To be sure, dogness can be abstracted and considered as an idea or concept in someone's mind. But even then, it depends on the person doing the thinking and abstracting. Not to mention the fact that this is only possible because dogness existed first as a real substantial form in individual substances themselves, namely dogs. Let us return to the question of being, and in so doing, turn our attention from the thought of Aristotle to that of Thomas Aquinas. In many ways, the concept of being or existence is a very slippery one. What exactly does it mean to say that something exists? One of the most important points that Aquinas makes is that existence is a real attribute that we may rightly or wrongly predicate of something. For example, whereas it is true to say that the United States Capitol building exists, it is false to say that unicorns exist. In other words, the U.S. Capitol has existence, whereas unicorns do not. Moreover, whether or not something has existence appears to be a completely separate consideration from that of the essence that that thing might have. In other words, it is perfectly comprehensible to consider the essence or nature of a unicorn, irrespective of whether such an animal actually exists. Because of this, Aquinas makes the astute observation that existence and essence are distinct aspects of a thing. The question of a thing's essence refers to what a thing is, while the question of a thing's existence or being refers us to whether a thing is. This is what Aquinas means when he argues that being is not a genus or a kind. Think of it this way. It makes good sense to divide the genus of animals into the species of vertebrate and invertebrate. Likewise, it makes sense to divide the genus of living things into plants and animals. Furthermore, material things and immaterial things may be divided into living things and non-living things. It may be tempting then to say that material things and immaterial things are themselves species of a supergenus or a superkind called beings, which encompasses everything. And yet Aquinas insists that this would be a mistake. The very word genus means kind. But to be a being is not to be a particular kind of thing, such as a plant, an animal, a vertebrate, or an invertebrate. To say that something is a being is merely to say that it exists, and not to say that it is this or that kind of thing, or that it has this or that essence. Being and essence, therefore, are just different aspects of things. Thus understood, when someone says that the U.S. Capitol exists, or that Mount Rushmore exists, they are predicating something actual about those things, namely existence. The concept of existence, in other words, is not already contained in the concepts of those things. None of them exist by necessity or by definition, but rather they happen to exist. And so the fact of their existence requires something else as an explanation. We will examine this teaching more fully in later lectures, but it will be useful to know that ultimately, Thomas Aquinas argues that the only way to provide a satisfactory account of existence at all is to admit the existence of a being in whom existence and essence are not distinct, but are rather one and the same, a being whose very essence is existence. And this, of course, is God. Again, we will discuss God's unique mode of existing in later lectures. For now, it will be more helpful to focus our attention upon the existence of created things more within the scope of our experience and understanding. As Thomas Aquinas explains, it is important to observe that existence contains certain properties common to all things that have existence. Common, that is, to all things that exist. These properties Aquinas refers to as the transcendentals, because they are properties not specific to any genus, not specific, that is, to any particular kind of thing that exists. Instead, as with being or existence itself, these properties transcend all genuses or kinds because they are common to everything. Everything, that is, that exists. The most frequent transcendental properties of being mentioned by Thomas Aquinas are oneness, truth, and goodness. Let's first consider oneness or unity. Everything that exists is, in some sense, one. This does not mean that existing things need to be a perfect unity, or that they cannot admit of parts. But if something exists at all, there must be some unity to which that something refers. To be, in short, is to be something. And to be something is to have some degree of unity. To be some whole of which one's parts are parts. To the extent that it makes sense to say that an automobile exists, therefore, is to say that the parts of the automobile, the engine, the transmission, the electrical system, are parts of a unified whole. Truth is similar. To the extent that something exists, and this existing thing is this or that kind of thing, it must be intelligible as this or that kind of thing. Much of this teaching is relatable to Aristotle's doctrine of form. All things that exist have some form or another, even if some things, such as angels, have no material component. A human being has the form of humanity. A tree has the form of treeness. A dog has the form of dogness. And to the extent that something has a form, it can be understood as a this or a that. It's impossible to find something just existing that just isn't any kind of thing. So when Aquinas says that all beings are also true, he simply means that all beings are capable of being understood by our intellects as one kind of being or another, whereby the thing's form may be abstracted by our minds and become an idea in our minds. In short, therefore, truth is nothing other than existence with a special reference to existence's knowability. This finally brings us to the transcendental property of goodness, perhaps the most easily misunderstood of the transcendental properties of being. Like unity and truth, goodness is nothing other than existence itself regarded from a particular perspective. This is why Aquinas repeats that goodness, like truth, is convertible with being. So to say that goodness is convertible with being is to say that everything that exists, and to the extent that it exists, is good. Does this mean that evil, which is the opposite of goodness, doesn't exist? In a sense, Aquinas' answer to this question is yes. Evil, as evil, does not have any existence unto itself, but is rather a privation of some goodness that ought to be present. So, for example, it is a certain kind of evil that an animal might be blind or lame. But that blindness or lameness is not some existing thing added to the animal's existence, but it is rather a lack of something that ought to be there. In this case, sight, or the full use of the animal's legs. This example highlights another important aspect of Aquinas' understanding of goodness, which has the sense of completion or perfection. For something to lack goodness is, on his teaching, for it to be incomplete or imperfect in some identifiable way. So even though a man lacks the ability to fly, this would not be evil, because flight is not part of man's nature. This is not an ability that man ought to have, given the kind of being he is, though the inability to fly would be evil for an eagle or a hawk, because not being able to fly would leave that eagle or hawk incomplete in an important sense. Of course, this understanding of good and evil has no special moral significance. We don't blame the hawk for not being able to fly, or the man for being blind. But we might blame the man for, say, not being able to tell the truth. Not telling the truth is morally evil, not only because a man might be blamed for it, but on an even more fundamental level, because not telling the truth signifies an incompleteness in the man himself. It is a lack of good that goes right to the core of his existence, right to the core of the kind of being he is. It might be helpful to add, on a final note, that Aquinas' teaching as to the convertibility of being and goodness is adopted from St. Augustine, who for many years was deeply troubled by what philosophers now call the problem of evil. If God is pure goodness and created everything, where could evil, good's opposite, possibly come from? This question caused Augustine to doubt seriously the Catholic faith of his own mother, which taught that God is all good, all powerful, and the creator of everything that exists. Augustine even fell in with a dangerous cult known as Manichaeanism, which denied the existence of a single cause of all existence, and instead posited two divine beings, one good, the other evil, whose struggle against one another ultimately explains the struggle between good and evil we witness in human affairs all the time. But ultimately, Augustine realized that if God truly is the creator and the source of everything that exists, it is impossible that evil should have any existential reality of its own. This doesn't mean that evil is merely illusory. Existing things really are lacking in important ways that, if they were fully complete, they would not be lacking. Yet this does not change the fact that evil only exists as a lack or a privation of some good thing. Not even the devil himself, says Augustine, is evil in and of himself. He is rather a metaphysically good being that has terribly turned away from the goodness that resides in him on account of his existence. In fact, if he was not a metaphysically good being, his turning away couldn't really be called evil in any meaningful sense. It only is evil because it cuts against the grain of what his existence requires for its fulfillment and perfection. At least in this respect, human beings are not different. When we turn away from God and commit evil actions, we are not turning towards evil. The evil simply is in the turning away. The transcendental properties of being are, of course, a significant addition to Aristotle's doctrine of existence, in light of a metaphysics that recognizes God as the source of existence and the key to understanding the created world of existing things. A doctrine that is just absent in the writings of Aristotle. In the following lectures, therefore, we will explore Thomas Aquinas' understanding of God's existence much more fully, his arguments for God's existence, and what those arguments tell us about the kind of being that God is and his relationship with the created world.